Okay, everybody, a very warm welcome. Thank you so much for making it today to join the Our Shared World Learning Lunch. We have an amazing setup today. We have Jonathon Porrit to come and talk to us, and we're so excited about it. A quick run through for anyone who's new to the Our Shared World Learning Lunches. We have a rapid fire 15 minutes where the speaker will talk about their area of expertise, and then we pose a question, a provocation, and you're put into breakout groups with lots of other people. We encourage you to introduce yourselves and make connections. And then you feed back the ideas from your group, and Jonathon's going to finish with a reflection on those thoughts. So thank you for making it today. Anne, over to you.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Jonathon. He was my boss for a while, for about 6 years, so quite well from the sustainable development years. But it's fantastic having Jonathon here for a couple of reasons. The first is that when we started our shared world, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, one of the big areas of interest of most people was this idea policy. Not quite sure what policy meant. I think it means advocacy, campaigning, policy, and maybe some of the work that Jonathan's done working inside governments in plural. So Jonathan has an enormously long history in this field. Um, Probably only bettered by David Attenborough, who I wouldn't call a campaigner, but everyone seems to think he's the environmentalist. I think they've got it wrong, Jonathan. I think it's you. And we're delighted that you're going to talk about your experiences and what you've learned in terms of advocacy and campaigning. It feels like we're in a very different place now in the formal education side, but there's lots of other work to do, and I'm delighted that you're also going to talk about things to do with young people, because that's for most people here, that's an area of big concern. So a big thank you, Jonathan, for giving up your time to do this, and over to you.
Uh, my pleasure. Thanks, Anne. Yes, the chair of the Sustainable Development Commission wasn't really a conventional boss role. I'm sure you all
No.
understand, but nonetheless, it was a very exciting 9, 10 years, which I look back on with a great deal of nostalgic delight, because quite honestly, you'd be hard put to find too many references to the concept, let alone the power of sustainable development in today's government circles. I will go a little bit into some policy issues, depends where the thoughts take me, as it were. I should start by saying that I was a teacher. A long time ago, I became a teacher in 1973, same year that 1 year after I joined the Green Party. I was a teacher of English and drama, so my head of department was more than a little concerned when my classroom was turned into what I can only describe as a living jungle with lots of green plants and creatures in it, and she couldn't quite see what that had to do with teaching Shakespeare or anything else. But I only mention that anecdote because, as we all know, whatever the conventional curriculum says, or the formal curriculum says, about what the authorities think young people's brains should be exposed to, what teachers do in classrooms and beyond the classroom is something a bit extra. And good teaching is never constrained by the formal curriculum. Good teaching always reaches beyond that formal curriculum. And I'm very struck by that, because we have just recently heard that in a sort of moment of enlightenment, the Secretary of State for Education in this government has just agreed that the curriculum will now somehow incorporate a GCSE in natural history. And that'll be squeezed in amongst everything else that is bidding for very scarce time within the curriculum. And that's the result of 5 or 6 years of assiduous campaigning by the amazing Mary Colwell, who's written a wonderful book about curlews, should you be in need of a little bit of contact with raw nature at its best, and with Caroline Lucas's dedicated support over those 5 years. And it's good to see that sometimes things do change in that way. Of course, teachers today through the curriculum are all struggling with how to reflect the climate and nature emergencies. And I mean really struggling, because it is an absolutely huge challenge. And I've seen that in a rather different light over the last year, because for the course of that year, I've been working with 26 young Just Stop Oil activists. I say young, only 2 of them are older than 26. So I'm 50 years older than almost all of them, which has been a humbling experience. And I mention that because when putting together the profiles of these 26 young people, many of whom have been in prison, 5 still are in prison, and some are out on bail, and others are awaiting their trials and all the rest of it. But in conversations with them, their formal educational experience was clearly very significant. Unprompted, I suspect about 80% of them mentioned that the start to what they're doing now, which, if you like, is at the outer edge of activism, largely because they think that governments are completely failing to develop the right policy response to what the science tells us. But for them, what they first heard and thought about and experienced in schools was clearly a significant part of how they got to be where they are today. A lot of other things happened to them along the way, of course, as we know. And I've no doubt some of those things were much more influential than what happened to them when they were in school. But nonetheless, it's interesting. There's one young person in particular, activist in particular, who told an anecdote in his interview, providing more of a background to himself as a person. And he recalled in astonishing detail this moment at primary school when 2 representatives of a well-known NGO, WWF, I believe, if I remember rightly, turned up at the school and gave a talk about climate change. And this stuck in his mind, as he said. It was sort of maybe 8 or 9 years before he came back to it, but he stuck in his mind because at a certain point in their presentation, the woman who was sharing the presentation with the boss, the male boss of WWF at that time, the woman was really profoundly moved and upset by the fact that in his presentation he said, and within the course of a few years, it could be too late to do anything about climate change. Verbatim, that's what he said. And she felt, afterwards he heard the story, she felt that was a terrible thing to say to relatively young children. And that putting it in those terms meant that they would come away from that talk uncertain about what their future would hold and not really knowing whether or not they were entitled to thoughts about a conventional career path, about life, whatever it was. And my interviewee, Jacob, said at that time, she just looked down at the floor and didn't say another word. And I was very struck by this anecdote because it obviously, the detail of it absolutely stuck in his mind. And I suppose that reminded me, if anybody needs reminding, that the power of these moments, the power of the way we talk about these things is huge. And people can be affected in many, many different ways as a consequence of it. And the dilemma for all of us is that if we are going to get the kind of policy responses that we need to the deteriorating state of science, of the scientific knowledge we have about the climate and nature emergencies, then we have to have people whose brains can accommodate this level of insight. And this preys on the minds of activists enormously, is what is the state of understanding of decision makers today, particularly political decision makers? What is the receiving medium, if you like, when they are trying to explain why the current policy response is so utterly, uselessly inadequate when you take full account of what the science tells us? And their worry, of course, is that they can explain this day in, day out, but there isn't basically the means by which those decision makers can properly grapple with it. And it wasn't accidental that when Extinction Rebellion first launched themselves into our lives back in 2018, that one of the first demands that they had was tell the truth. Sounds extraordinarily simple. Tell the truth. They meant tell the truth about the climate, but also about the nature emergencies. Tell the truth. Just make sure that people know the truth. Now, we know that that doesn't happen, that the truth is not being shared. The truth about the climate and nature emergencies is not being shared. Some of you may remember a guy called Angus Rose, who 4 years ago was so utterly distraught at the lack of understanding on the part of MPs here in the UK that he went on hunger strike. And at the time, I think XR was still doing its stuff then. Others were saying, what? You can't go on a hunger strike just because you feel politicians aren't very well informed. And the demand of his hunger strike was that a full briefing should be given to all MPs in the chamber about the current science regarding climate change. That was his demand. And when the government turned down that demand, the minister at that time was a little Tory upstart called Greg Hands. And Greg Hands dismissed his demand out of hand and said, all MPs know as much as they need to know about climate change. That's the sort of phrase that has stuck with me since then. So he went on hunger strike, and he was on hunger strike for 20 odd days, 27 days, whatever it might be. And people really began to get quite concerned about him. And Caroline Lucas then organized a bit of a compromise. She persuaded Sir Ian Vallance, who was the government's chief scientific advisor at the time, that he would voluntarily do a briefing for MPs, not in the full chamber, because that obviously was not in his command, but would do a full briefing for those MPs who wanted to come. So Angus then stopped his hunger strike. The briefing took place. Caroline tells me that 3 MPs turned up. And we can legitimately be concerned, when you think about this from an educational perspective, that so few people in decisions of real influence or even power are as informed as they need to be about the state of our world today. So for campaigners, this presses very hard on how they think about tactics and how they try and work their way into the sphere of influence of politics today to make it more amenable to a proper understanding of the climate. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm passing over this lightly because I'm gabbling a bit and speaking a bit too fast, but trying to get through as much as I possibly can. I know how hard this is. And I had a personal experience of this last week, which I will just briefly mention. There was a huge new study published at the beginning of last week, looking at the new phenomenon of huge pulses of methane being released in the Antarctic. Now, I'm not going to go into the science of this in much detail, but we're very familiar with pulses, releases of methane in the Arctic, particularly from the permafrost and the coastal area just off the Siberian coast there. Nobody has ever measured methane releases in the Antarctic before. And this was a huge new report. And I'm doing my usual doom scrolling. I came across this report and read it and thought, oh, my God, wait a minute, this is huge, because methane is a very, very powerful greenhouse gas. And a lot of scientists, particularly those studying the permafrost and the Arctic environment, are very concerned that we could have this massive release of methane, which would accelerate the process of climate change dramatically. And so I was chatting to a friend of mine about this just the day after, and he said, I don't want to know about that, Jonathon. I don't want to know about it. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want you to send me the reference. I've got enough going on in my brain already. And I do not want you to tell me that now we've got this additional, hitherto unknown phenomenon going on about methane pulses in the Antarctic. And it wasn't a joke. It was just stop. Psychologists refer to this as the notion of psychic numbing, that there is a point beyond which our little brains cannot cope with the degree to which these vast natural systems are shifting because of the intervention in those systems of human activities of our economy. And psychic numbing is a really big problematic barrier to overcome. I suspect that a lot of the relatively ignorant politicians today are just too busy, too complacent, too inert to cope with this. But they are also a little bit driven into that place where they think, what am I going to do? What do I do about this? And you keep laying this stuff on me. And I know that in policy terms, it's going to be very hard to do. So for anybody involved in awareness raising, in education, in the whole story about advocacy and narratives about a better world, we are constantly struggling with the difficulty of communicating this hard-edged physical reality. And don't forget, the planet couldn't give a shit about levels of optimism or pessimism in society or in people's minds. Who cares from nature's point of view? Completely irrelevant. But we know how hard it is to break through, to get people to proportionately respond to what we now know. I think this is still a huge challenge. And working with these 26, and this is my last point, 26 activists, the thing that I've really learned is that they've been driven to these, some would say, irresponsible acts of civil disobedience, of nonviolent protest, because they recognize that the message isn't getting through in any other way. And we're all living in a society where these messages are not getting through. For one reason or another, they're not getting through. And for Just Stop Oil, the biggest issue they had to deal with was, if you can't get the messages through in a conventional campaigning way with a view to changing policy in the time-honored way, then you have to resort to some pretty dramatic, attention-grabbing stunts, acts of nonviolent civil disobedience, which will compel the media to cover those issues in the way that they don't want to do otherwise. So all I'm really doing is sharing this complexity at the moment, this impasse that we're in, where we don't respond to the science in the way that we should. We've run out of easy ways of doing the communications responsibly, compassionately, in terms of both the giver of the information and the receiver of the information. And we need some very different ways of addressing this. Not least as Just Stop Oil has now just hung up its high vis, as they announced 10 days ago. And the phenomenon of civil disobedience in this country today has temporarily been beaten back. But I wasn't going to go there today, so I won't. Okay, that's me lot. I'll stop there. Thanks, Anne. Sorry.
That's all right. That was great. Thank you, Jonathon. Some great stories there that really bring out the key points. well, we've got a question that we're going to ask everyone to think about, and we're going to put you into breakout groups. And I think Kathy has got the question because I forgot to write it down. But one of the things that we hope that we will talk about is the fact that the dark waters that Jonathan's trying to avoid disappearing into, these are his words, not mine. And he really wants to ask the question, and tell me if I got this right, Kathy, about how can educators, both formally and informally, address the question that I think Jonathan's conversation there has brought up for us, whether we need to reform or whether we need revolution. And it's really the role of educators, both formally and informally, and how that might play out.
Welcome back, everyone. As always, these learning lunches rip through at an absolute pace. So Jonathan sped through 15 minutes of incredibly interesting content and then back into just a small amount of time with you in your breakout rooms. We're aware that for some people you need to head off now, and that's absolutely okay. But for those of us that can stay with us just for this last little bit, what we'd love to know is if we could have one representative from each breakout group just to share a summary of what came up in your group in the chat. So if you can, yes, just share a summary, and what we'll do is we'll have a little look at those thoughts, and Jonathan will just share some final responses to what was going on. We know that it's almost impossible to ask you to sum up everything that possibly came up in your group in one or two sentences, but if you could just share some of the key points, maybe, particularly if you've got someone that can take the lead on that. So Leanne shared revolution would be ideal, with students in charge of redesigning their learning experiences, being in nature and freeing themselves from the way we think and behave. So yeah, so many good things coming through. There's a lot of votes for revolution, I think. Another vote from Anne's group about revolution over reform. Rachel's talking about how the next generation thinks, feels, and acts will determine the world we live in. So it's a non-negotiable when the question comes of adaptation or revolution, having values-based, co-creative, emotionally regulating, active process of living and learning together. I'll let a few more of these come through now. We've got looking at framing revolution as a way of creating alternatives. Many people, Maria's mentioned, that are exhausted by reform, that revolution seems to be the only way forward. I did say this, didn't I, Jonathan, that this is going to be a group of people who are very much voting for revolution over reform. Yes, we've got a few more here. Revolution likely coming anyway, says Morgan. A very good point there. It needs to be framed as a positive thing, led by change makers. Education systems have clear societal purpose that can play a role in this to equip young people. Yes, Jenny mentions Audre Lorde's the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. Revolution is the only way. Still more coming through. And again, I'll just let everyone have time just to read through a couple of these. But Jonathan, I know, again, it's all coming at you at once, but any thoughts that you would like to share just based on some of these ideas that are coming through the chat?
Oil was extremely reluctant to admit that the government's new acts, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, and then the new Public Order Act in 2023, that this had a big deterrent effect on them. But the truth is it had a big deterrent effect on them. And it was getting harder and harder to persuade people to undertake those kind of acts of non-violent civil disobedience. And I think we have to accept that that context now is much less amenable to the kind of protests that we've done before. And that has led to an outbreak of another kind of crazy discussion, which is the moderate flank lining up against the radical flank, which is the moderate flank kind of saying, oh, well, direct action hasn't worked. It's alienated a lot of people. We need to go back, double down on all our good old processes, conscience raising, lobbying, advocacy, chatting to your MP, petitioning, online stuff, etc., etc. And people on the radical flank saying, really? You mean like what we've been doing for the last 50 years? So expect a very lively, ongoing debate about theories of change in society, and that will have big implications for educators, because we're always trying to think about how to engineer change more effectively, and no one wants to be involved in things that they know are ineffective. Well, actually, I withdraw that statement. I know a lot of people are perfectly happy with doing things they know are completely ineffective because it's better than doing nothing, but not much better. Don't forget, Saul Bellow, wonderful novelist, made a very, very pithy comment once where he said that a great deal of intelligence can be invested in ignorance, especially when the need for illusion is so deep. And we are investing a huge amount in, and please don't interpret this disparagingly, in keeping people stupid. And I'm not using that word to demean people's intelligence. I'm just saying, in Trumpian terms, almost stupid, because there's no way they can get beyond that, given the quality of the discussions that we have today.
Jonathon, thank you so much. I think we're now well over time. Thank you very much to everybody who's come along. Really, we could have spent the afternoon very easily with you. So thank you very, very much for your time and your provocations. I just very quickly am going to let you all know about the next Learning Lunch, which will be on the 29th. And we've got Justin Dillon, Bill Finnegan and Isabel Talks from the NAEE, the National Association for Environmental Education. And they're coming along to talk about their report on the state of environmental sustainability and climate education in UK schools and effective practice in the classroom. So please do come back and join us for that. Thank you very much, Jonathon. Lots to think about, and hope to see you all again very soon.
Thanks, Kathy. Lovely to spend some time with you all. Thanks a lot.